now and say hi everyone and welcome to this webinar called Staffing Up for Inclusion. I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker, Jeffrey MacCharles, who's assistant professor at Michigan State University and has focused his research on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sport industry. So Jeff, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone. And I just want to say a big thank you to Sarah and Monica for inviting me to speak on this topic to you all today. Again, as Sarah said, my name is Jeff MacCharles. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as a cisgender gay man, and I feel it's important to state that before a talk like this because my experiences and my identity serve as the lens through which I view these topics and my research. So you'll see me refer to that a few times through the presentation. But for now, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get this rolling. So just a little bit about my background. I am an assistant professor of sport coaching, leadership and administration at Michigan State University. We have an online master's degree program in sport coaching, leadership and administration. So I'm responsible for designing the curriculum and teaching the courses in the administration concentration. I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and have lived in the United States since 2012 with stops in Massachusetts, which is where I met my husband, Florida, and now Michigan. As such, being an immigrant is also one of my key social identities that make up who I am. I obtained my PhD in management with a sports management concentration at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2020. My cognate or my focal area was in organizational behavior, as I wanted to study the people who work in sport organizations, particularly through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. I was quite the world traveler in my younger days. And so I moved to the United Kingdom to obtain my master's degree in sport management in 2008 and 2009. And I also spent a year teaching English in Japanese public elementary and junior high schools through the JET program after I graduated with my bachelor's degrees in biology and psychology from the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. And my professional experience outside of higher education includes working in the fitness industry and for a marketing agency with a particular focus on sport clients. As Sarah alluded to at the beginning, my research interests involve looking at human resource practices and policies, as well as organizational behavior concepts and how they relate to marginalized individuals and groups within the context of sport organizations. My dissertation investigated the use of identity management techniques, such as the covering of one's marginalized identities during the application and hiring process for sport organizations, and also how marginalized individuals manage their stigmatized social identities once they are working in the sport workplace. I am a curler and have been so for 27 years and counting, although I've had to stop and start back up numerous times based on living abroad or prioritizing things like school. I've been a member of the Mayflower Curling Club in Halifax, Canada, the Granite Curling Club in Ottawa, Canada, and Broomstones Curling Club in Wayland, Massachusetts. I also had the opportunity to curl in Japan through an initiative for JET program alumni, which is the program that I taught English through in the mid-2000s. And that allowed me to return to my home prefecture in Japan and spend a week there engaging with citizens and residents of my former home. And I chose to promote curling through a number of activities through that experience. So that picture that you see there was actually me with a floor curling set that belonged to the Japanese Curling Association. And I was lucky enough to work with Rocks and Rings in order to allow me to use that set to do some activities in Japan. And I also did do some on-ice lessons as well. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. I want to cover a few different topics, and I'll start with explaining to you the importance of how making the case for our curling organizations to be diverse, equitable, inclusive is really important. So how do we make the case for DEI? Then I'll speak about the importance of attracting diverse candidates, followed by how we can actually recruit them. And then I'll finish with some parting thoughts that demonstrate how complex the issue of diverse and inclusive recruitment can be, and some things to think about as you leave. And of course, I'm anxious to have some discussion at the end, and I hope you'll have some questions to ask. So to start, I just want to introduce you to some key concepts. And again, many of you on this webinar may be familiar with all of the terms on this slide, but I think it is important to underscore the key differences between some of these terms if we're going to develop effective human resource strategies around both recruitment and retention of diverse individuals to curling organizations. So when we talk about diversity, we often refer to it as counting the heads. So it's all about the existence of these socially meaningful differences amongst a dyad, which is two people or a larger group, and essentially, again, counting them up. Now, when it comes to inclusion, we talk more about making the heads count. So I've heard the connection between the two terms to be something like diversity is inviting everyone to the party, but inclusion is making sure that everyone has a good time. And so when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about the degree to which employees are free to express their individuated self while also having a sense of workplace connectedness and belonging. What's important for leaders, especially in sport, but really everywhere, to remember is that having diversity is not enough by any means. In fact, engaging in efforts to improve your diversity without thinking about strategies for inclusion can actually create more issues than it produces benefits. And then finally, I want to make clear the distinction between visible or surface level diversity and invisible or deep level diversity. And it's important to understand that distinction. So we can think of surface level diversity as things that are readily visible, such as one's race or the gender they present as, or potentially a visible physical disability. Deep level diversity is concerned with those components of one's social identity that we cannot readily see. That could include one's sexual orientation, their religion, or even something like a learning disability. While there are ways that we can portray these deep level identities on the surface, such as say through our clothing, that is the traditional way we delineate these different types of diversity. But the important thing to remember for you all is that we cannot think of diversity as only those visible elements or simply as race and gender. We also have to consider the challenges of intersectionality. And that exists when individuals possess multiple stigmatized identities. And that means they're vulnerable to many of those isms that we hear about, such as racism or sexism, or to say racism and homophobia or something like that. So that creates additional challenges for developing inclusive spaces when you have to consider that some individuals are impacted by multiple marginalized identities. Now, academics in the DEI space are often compelled to argue as to why diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, which seems like it has an obvious answer, which is really that moral case. However, it's not always as easy just to point to the moral case and be done with it. Some people want more. And while I'm sure those of you that are on this call can see the sort of obvious nature of the moral case, there are probably some people that you work with in your curling organizations who might need a little bit more of a robust or holistic case for DEI. And so you can point them to the business case. Those people that are interested in this kind of information are often receptive to the business case because it impacts the bottom line of the organization. So when we look at the business case in particular, we know, and research has demonstrated that diverse organizations have enhanced decision-making and create innovative solutions. We hear people say that diversity creates dissent, and without that, you aren't going to have any major breakthroughs or innovation. So there can actually be positives to some of that dissent that can be created by having people of different backgrounds in the room, and that is often creativity and innovation. It also means that you can have greater understanding of diverse consumers and clients. So people from different backgrounds understand their peers from similar backgrounds, which helps from a consumer behavior and a marketing standpoint. In one of my studies, I interviewed a gay man who was working for a professional sports team. And he said that when he moved from one team to another and he ended up in a more progressive city in the United States with a lot of LGBTQ folks, he was able to use his experience as a gay man to help market to them. When it comes to performance, this can be related directly to profits, but can also be tied to other measures. As you'll see in the bullet point below, there was a McKinsey & Co. Report that came out in 2019 that showed that with gender diverse companies, those that were in the top quartile of gender diversity in terms of their executive leadership, they were 25% more likely to financially outperform those companies in the bottom quartile of diversity. So basically the top 25% of those gender diverse companies were 25% more likely to financially outperform those at the bottom of that scale. For ethnically diverse companies, it was actually even greater, where the top quartile of ethnically diverse companies in terms of their executive leadership were 36% more likely to financially outperform the bottom quartile. So all this is telling us is that there are many reasons as to why DEI is important to organizations. And again, while for most of us, the moral case is really the important one to make, for others, they want more. And so you can point them to the business case. However, the diversity performance relationship is more complex than just a one-dimensional experience. Research, particularly in the sport industry, has found that in order for diversity to have significant impacts on organizational performance, it must be tied to strategic inclusive initiatives, policies, and cultures. So when we look at some of this research in the sport industry, we can look to Cunningham's work on NCAA athletic departments. Now, for those of you not in the United States or not familiar with the United States collegiate athletic model, the NCAA is the governing body for collegiate sport. So in separate studies, Cunningham looked at the influence of racial and ethnic staff diversity and sexual orientation staff diversity on organizational performance. Organizational performance in this case was measured based upon points gained in a competition known as the NACDA Directors Cup, which essentially gives collegiate athletic departments points for the results of their many teams throughout the year. Cunningham found in both of his studies that diverse departments that also had proactive diversity management strategies, which meant that they were inclusive, outperformed their peers. So what this tells us is that diverse and inclusive sport organizations outperform their peers. They win more games and they make more money. Their employees feel more supported, they feel more empowered, and thus they do a better job. We've seen some research as well looking at board gender diversity impacting performance. This study by Wicker and colleagues from Germany looked at nonprofit sport clubs. And what they found was that when it came to looking at things like different types of problems that organizations can encounter, gender diverse boards led to having a gender diverse board led to having lower instances of both human resource problems as well as financial problems. And actually, when it came to human resource problems, even having one woman on the board resulted in significantly fewer human resource problems, which was actually a unique finding in the nonprofit sport club context, because there has been research that has shown that just having one woman on a corporate board in sort of that corporate for-profit setting actually creates more issues of tokenism and doesn't necessarily have a number of benefits. So this was actually a unique finding in this case in the nonprofit sport world. And with financial problems, as well as I mentioned, the more gender diverse the board, the smaller the financial problems. And it was interesting that they found that having a woman in the chairperson role actually significantly reduced financial problems. So again, there are all of these different reasons as to why we can advocate for being diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our curling organizations. But we also have to remember that inclusion starts at the top. And because we know that inclusion is that extra piece of the diversity performance puzzle, we know its importance, but we have to acknowledge that leadership plays a key role in creating inclusive environments in organizations. So again, leadership oftentimes are the ones that are responsible for developing or ensuring that a culture comes to fruition within an organization. So if they have that inclusive attitude, they can embed that in that culture. Also, having a diverse leadership group allows unique experiences to be brought to the decision-making table. And that can be very effective because those people from those diverse backgrounds can advocate more forcefully for change because they have the experiences and they know how important it is for a workplace to be inclusive. So that's kind of the introduction. So now I want to move on to talking more about attraction. So as I said in that opening segment, we know being diverse and inclusive has benefits. So how do we become diverse and inclusive as an organization, and in particular as a curling organization? So we need to think about diversity being a pipeline issue. So when we think about human resource processes, we often think of the recruitment, retention, mentoring process. When organizations struggle with diversity, they often have challenges with their pipeline of potential recruits. Now, they may also have retention problems once they're hired and working in the organization, which also have to be dealt with and examined. But first, we have to think about who is in our pipeline. We can't hire diverse candidates if they're not in our pipeline. So what is the missing piece of this process? We have to think about attraction. So we have to consider the fact that diverse candidates are looking to be attracted to our organizations. During the recruitment process, organizations have to be aware that the candidates are looking for things to be connected to and to feel like an organization will be a good place for them to work. This can happen before recruitment even starts as well, with potential job seekers scanning the online job postings and then doing research on organizations that have posted jobs, even before they interact with anybody from the organization. So the question then becomes, well, how can you attract diverse candidates? Well, we need to signal to them that your curling organization is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So we can look to the theoretical world for that. Signaling theory is a theory that I've used quite a bit in my research, and it applies in a variety of settings, including consumer behavior and marketing, as well as human resources. Boiled down simply, Signaling theory is about reducing information asymmetry between parties. So what is information asymmetry? It means that two parties, in this case, an organization and an applicant, lack information about each other. They don't have the same information. So in order to reduce information asymmetry, both parties will send signals to each other in order to reduce ambiguity from that information asymmetry and to ultimately enhance their perceived status. So in terms of applicants sending signals to organizations, an applicant would go and get a degree, and that degree says something about their perceived status. They have a certain level of education. And so that communicates information about the applicant. Think about it. If you've ever hired a person, again, you're basing it off of a resume and a cover letter, oftentimes early in the beginning. And so applicants have to put in signals in that resume and cover letter that tell us about them. On the flip side, organizations have to provide signals about who they are as an organization, what they value. And individuals who are seeking jobs will be looking for those signals in order to interpret whether or not that looks like a good organization to work for or not a good organization to work for. What does this have to do with attracting diverse candidates? Well, applicants conduct research and scan for information about organizations, oftentimes prior to applying for jobs. In my dissertation research, I actually found that people from marginalized backgrounds look for signals demonstrating DEI within organizations. So they're actively looking for, do they have a diversity and equity and inclusion statement on their website somewhere? What kind of people are featured in their marketing or in their recruitment materials? And so this idea here that people are constantly scanning, and people that have these marginalized identities are going to be more likely to look for signals that demonstrate DEI. Now, this looks like a very complex theoretical model, but it's actually quite simple to work through. And this is a model of how signaling theory can be applied to the human resource process of recruitment. So basically, we have two levels of signals that can be sent: organizational level signals and individual level signals. Now, I'll go through some examples on the next slide, but organizational signals are relatively self-explanatory. The individual signals typically refer to signals from the recruiter or recruiters themselves that people might be interacting with. Now, these signals are then interpreted by an applicant who can then make inferences about what those signals mean about the organization. So I could make the inference, oh, that's an inclusive organization, or that's not an inclusive organization, or not a diverse organization. I can make the inference that, oh, that company seems to value profit over everything. Or maybe based on my research, it looks like they have a very laid back vibe in the office. However, the interpretation of those signals is affected by what's called the applicant's organizational identity salience. In other words, how important the organization is to the applicant's identity. For example, as a curler, curling is a big part of my identity. So that would cause me to interpret the signals in a way that was different from someone for whom curling is not part of their identity. Those inferences that we make then influence how strongly an applicant begins to identify with an organization. Basically, they start to think, is this going to be the place for me? And then based on that level of organizational identification, that will lead to applicant attraction outcomes. So then they'll actually decide to pursue the job, they'll submit their application, or maybe it means that they'll actually accept the job if it's offered to them. This also indirectly then affects an organization's applicant pool, sort of, again, going up to that organizational level of this model, where, again, if you're successful in sort of having those signals interpreted in the way that you're hoping in order to attract a diverse group of applicants, it will improve both the quantity and the quality of the organization's applicant pool. Now, again, I mentioned that there are different levels of signaling. So we have these organizational market signals and these individual market signals. So the organizational level will be things like your brand image or your organizational representation. Those are things that, again, the organization sends out as a signal. There are also other signals that people can find. The Human Rights Campaign in the United States has what's called a Corporate Equality Index. So they essentially, for a number, especially of big companies, they publish rankings on whether or not it's a good place for somebody who is LGBTQ+ to work. So those types of rankings that exist, sometimes there are business publication rankings too, like the top 100 places to work or things like that. I mean, if you're a smaller organization, you may not fit into those categories, but there could be local rankings as well in your local area, in your city or province or state. Also, things like corporate and recruitment advertising. So people can look at the advertising of a particular company and decide whether or not that seems to align with their own values. And then also you can look at their websites and social media and see what kind of messaging they're putting out there, what kind of information sits in those different repositories. And then we have the individual market signals, which again, as I mentioned, are more so the signals that you get from the people that you interact with in the organization. So for example, say you have a pre-screening interview with somebody, you're going to be paying attention to their characteristics and their behaviors. And you're going to make inferences about what the workplace might be like or what the organization might be like based on that person's characteristics and their behaviors. So let's look at an example of two different organizational signals. So let's pretend that I was looking for a job and diversity, equity, inclusion is really important to me. And so I go and I look at the web page for City Curling Club, we'll call it. And I go to the staff page and I look at the pictures. And this image on the left, again, represents what I would typically see. Everybody looks the same. In curling organizations, again, we are primarily white, and still in sport organizations as a whole, primarily we have more men in leadership positions, although we do have better gender diversity in curling, although it's not perfect. But still, the point of this is just to show you how different it can look if you have the situation on the right side of the screen, which shows a more diverse crop of people who work in that curling club. So for me, somebody who's looking for, and I can attest to this as an individual, when I'm looking for jobs, I 100% in scanning the department or scanning the organization's webpage and looking at who else works there and looking for places that do seem to embrace diversity or do seem to have a diverse crop of individuals. So this is the point in time where you have to think, what signals are you sending? And what I have on the slide here are a few different areas where you have to be very cognizant of the kind of signals that you're sending when you're trying to recruit candidates to your curling organization, whether that be a local curling club, whether that be a national or provincial governing body or an international governing body. So places that we need to be careful about: your website and social media. Do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement or section on your website? Do you have a standing committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion within the governance structure of your organization? And is that prominently displayed? And is there information about what that committee does? Staff and board photos and bios and pronouns. So again, like I showed you on the last slide, having photos of staff can be really important, but it can also send a negative signal to people showing that, again, it's not very diverse, particularly at the moment. One of the ways that you can attempt to remedy that is by having things like bios. So for example, you may have people with some invisible stigmatized identities that they're happy to share in a bio. So for example, for me, if I was an employee, say, of a curling club, and I was able to write a bio, I would talk about how, Jeff lives with his husband, Eric, and their 2 dogs. So that's signaling to somebody that, oh, wow, there are gay people that work in that organization. That's really important. Even something simple as having pronouns for everybody when they're listed. I know that for me, I'm a cisgender man, but when I see that somebody has pronouns in their email signature, I feel comfortable being able to engage in deeper conversation with them about my own identity, my own sexual identity. In fact, just the other day, I was volunteering at a vaccination site on our campus, and I was speaking to someone who seemed very nice. But when she mentioned her partner and used the gender neutral term of partner rather than boyfriend, her using the word partner made me feel comfortable with using the word husband. So that was really important to me. So those signals are very, very important. And again, it doesn't even matter if again, for me, my pronouns are he, him, his, but seeing somebody else put their pronouns out there says something to me about them. And so by being able to have your staff roster on your website and having everybody's pronouns there is a very clear signal about how you feel about diversity, equity, inclusion. You can also think about what you're putting on your social media. Are you featuring diverse employees? Are you featuring diverse members in your club? Are you featuring diverse groups that may use your facility so that it shows that, again, the facility itself is welcoming? In your job postings and application forms, this is something that people don't often think about. And in particular, if you don't have HR training and you have to do a job posting, oftentimes you're just recycling old job postings or maybe pulling a similar one off of a website and just editing it to sort of fit the role that you're hiring for. We have to be very careful because there is research out there that you have to be, you can be very exclusionary in the wording or phrasing of job postings and application forms. using words like competitive and things like that in a job posting can actually deter women from applying for jobs. So using particular adjectives or adverbs can deter certain groups of people. Also, things like allowing people to choose their gender and not focusing on the gender binary. So not just having, are you male or female, but giving options. We also have to have a conversation about how important it is to have curling experience for some of these jobs and board roles. And you'll notice that I'm kind of talking about this mostly related to staff, but we also have to think about it more broadly in terms of board members, and we can apply these things in that way as well. But what requirement is there for somebody to really have a tremendous amount of curling experience to be able to be a marketing assistant or a salesperson in a curling club? You know, obviously they need to understand a little bit about the game, but that can be trained and taught on the spot. But we are deliberately excluding potentially good, diverse candidates by by requiring that they have some level of curling experience or knowledge. And that stuff is very easy to be taught. So we have to be careful about how much we're weighting that. And maybe we can express something like, do you have sport experience, or what sports have you played growing up? There are, you know, similarities between sports sometimes. There are similar sort of cultural elements to them as well. So we have to be very careful about excluding people just on that basis alone. Also, do you have a non-discrimination or an equal opportunity employment statement in your job posting or on an application form? That is very important to people, especially in areas that do not have protections for things like racial or sexual orientation discrimination or gender discrimination in certain areas of countries or the world. Now, when it comes to signals through initiatives, are you partnering with community groups? That's an important signal to send. Groups that are doing important work in your area. You know, I just watched the webinar, I think it was just last week, about the Black Rock Initiative. And that's, you know, an important partnership that if you're a curling club, you should be, you know, that's something that you would want to partner with in order to send that positive signal about racial inclusion. Also, are you participating in DEI related events, things like pride parades? When I was doing my dissertation research, somebody had mentioned how when they went to the diversity page of this organization's website, sport organization's website, the first thing that they noticed were pictures of them participating in a local pride parade, and how that was really important for them as an open lesbian. She felt that she would be able to be herself in that sport workplace. So you can get involved in your community in those number of different ways, and that sends positive signals. We can also think about supplier diversity. That's something that oftentimes doesn't come up, but for people who are really passionate about this, they'll want to know that you are embracing supplier diversity and you're looking to support businesses in the community and across the country that have diverse ownership or support diverse causes and things like that. So that's another one, again, that sometimes doesn't get as much coverage or hype, but can be a really effective signal. So now I want to transition to recruitment. So again, the recruitment aspect is, again, attraction can sort of occur before the recruitment process even starts if somebody's doing their own research, or it can be kind of ongoing as recruitment is happening. But what we know is that curling organizations, both large and small, need to be more deliberate and proactive with their diversity recruitment strategies. So there are some questions that you want to ask yourself as an organization, including what underlying factors are creating the challenges for your organization in terms of recruiting diverse individuals. Where are you doing the recruiting, and who is doing the recruiting and actually making the ultimate hiring decision? So we do know that when it comes to recruitment, there are a few things that we have to be very careful with. There are some common obstacles that can exist within organizations that can limit effective diverse recruitment practices. So the first one is stereotyping. So obviously stereotyping is a commonly used term, but it refers to this fixed overgeneralized belief about a particular group or class of people. And that is very closely tied to one's implicit or unconscious bias. So essentially it's because of those stereotypes that many people have these attitudes or beliefs that occur in our unconscious or outside of our conscious awareness and control. The challenge is that those can be manifested in various ways, from microaggressions to full-fledged discriminatory actions like denying someone a promotion or not hiring someone because of a stereotype based on their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their disability. The other challenge that we have to deal with is what we call homologous reproduction. And this is really sort of this concept that exists within sort of the literature around power and organizational power. But it's this idea that those in power maintain influence by only allowing those with similar characteristics to gain access to that same power or influential positions. So the idea, and in sport, we talk about it a lot, where you have a lot of white heterosexual men that run organizations. And when they hire or they promote and they're giving people access to power, they're more likely to give it to people who look like them and who act like them and behave like them. Homologous, right? It's that they're similar, and you're just reproducing that over and over again. So we have to be very careful. And that's why I asked that question on the last slide: who is making the ultimate decision? And if it's going to be somebody, again, who is part of that majority, there is a risk that this homologous reproduction will occur. So how do we overcome these obstacles? What steps can we take to help improve our recruitment and hiring processes? Well, one of the things we should think about is diversifying our search committees. Now, if you're a small curling club and you're hiring, maybe just an ice tech or somebody like that, maybe there's only one of you that has to do the hiring because maybe there's only 3 of you on staff as it is. But in every instance, you should attempt to bring other people into the discussion. So if you lack staff diversity, look to volunteers at your club or look to members, especially if you're going to hire for a pretty high up position like the president of a club or the general manager or something like that. Bring members into the discussion as well, and make sure you're recruiting, again, members of different backgrounds. Their input can be very important as well. It doesn't mean that they're going to be the ones to make that final decision, but the purpose of a search committee is for everybody to share their thoughts and ideas. You also want to train your search committee. So staff and volunteers at your club should engage in diversity training anyways. And if they don't, that should be something that is on your agenda, because that will not only help them deal with diverse members and diverse participants, but also will help them with recruiting diverse staff members as well. Similarly for you, those of you in provincial or national or international governing bodies, thinking about making sure they have the training, they understand the concept of bias and ways that they need to be aware of those issues. Another thing to make sure you're doing is assessing skill sets. So provide your candidates with typical work scenarios or small tasks and projects to complete, because again, that allows them to demonstrate objectively that they can do this job. And that's where I get back to this idea again of how important is it for them to have curling experience or knowledge. If you're asking them to be a bookkeeper, what they need to be able to do is be able to manage the books, not necessarily understand the ins and outs of interns versus outturns. Or the free guard zone or any of those types of things. And then also another thing that is important, and this sometimes is overlooked, but standardizing interview questions. So you want to ensure that everyone is on the same level playing field when they're being asked questions. So this way you're not potentially asking questions to people that may be challenging for them, or you may be setting them up for failure. Standardizing interview questions allows you to assess everyone in the same way. You can also standardize your interview scoring form so that, again, it makes it much more objective. And that way you're not necessarily eliminating anybody based on potentially some stereotypes or biases. So how do we build the pipeline? So that's the other thing. So it's one thing to be able to recruit in a way that is free of bias and stereotypes and homologous reproduction, but we need to think about where we're looking for these people to fill these roles. So one thing that I know is that curling organizations in particular have to venture into new spaces to build that pipeline. So for those of you looking to hire staff, especially maybe if you're a local curling club or a provincial organization or regional organization or a national organization, contact local colleges and universities, attend those career fairs, meet with student groups, look for sport management programs. Sport management programs, I can tell you, I've worked in higher education and sport management for going on almost 10 years now. And we love to be contacted by sport organizations who are looking for interns, who are looking to hire somebody, who's ready to sort of get to work. And we're constantly looking for ways to connect our students with these types of organizations. So, you could even be able to maybe go in and speak to a class. This would be a great opportunity, especially in areas where maybe curling is not as popular, to be able to expose them to that new sport. I know that in some areas of the world, like in Canada, as a Canadian, I know that sport management programs are not necessarily very common. but many of the big universities do have them now. They also might be under different titles like recreation management or leisure studies. Those programs are really important. And you're going to find students who come from a number of diverse backgrounds. They're also going to be of a younger generation. So that's another thing we talk about when it comes to diversity, is that, you know, Gen X versus Gen Z versus millennials, making sure you're having that robust differentiation amongst sort of age groups as well. You can also work with your provincial or national sport organizations. I know that in the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee for a long time has done what's called the FLAME program. It's basically they invite a number of marginalized groups. I think FLAME stands for Finding Leaders Amongst Minorities Everywhere. And the idea is that they actually bring people from you know, those backgrounds that are traditionally marginalized in sport to Colorado Springs for basically a program of introducing them to the Olympic movement and those types of things. You know, I would like, you know, if you're a curling organization, like in this case, a USA Curling, or, you know, a regional association like the Great Lakes Curling Association or Grand National or something like that, you should be talking to the USOPC about that program, connecting with them, having those people, you know, maybe do a presentation at the conference that they go to. And because that is going to be, again, they're going to be people from marginalized backgrounds that are looking to work in amateur sport. And so that is a ripe group for connecting with. And maybe even your provincial or national sport organizations, maybe if they don't have these types of programs, maybe you could partner with them to create one. You know, I think about in Canada, the way that we have our provincial sport organizations, like I was familiar with Sport Nova Scotia. And, you know, I would contact them about what are they doing to try to recruit diverse individuals into the coaching and administrative ranks. And is there any way that we can partner with that in order to try to get some for our local curling clubs or curling organizations? You can also consider the rental groups or third-party curling organizations that use your facility. So many, I know that in Canada in particular, I know when I was at Mayflower Curling Club, we had an LGBTQ plus curling group, our curling league. They used to curl after my league on Sunday afternoons. And so they used our facility, but they weren't members of our club per se. They were members of this curling group that rented the ice. And so making connections with the leadership of those organizations, bringing them into the fold. Maybe you could hire one of them as a staff member at one point. Maybe they would be interested in joining your board. I also think about College Curling USA, again, a way to sort of get connected to college age students that might be interested in doing some work with your organization or your curling club as well. So, and that's going back into that safe space of people who know curling and like curling. But it is important, we can't forget about them, but we just have to think more broadly as well. When it comes to board members, seeking board members out, we can look at places like our local and national chambers of commerce that are affiliated with various marginalized groups. So the United States, Canada, you know, we have these Black chambers of commerce. We also have them locally. I know that I live in the greater Detroit area. We have a Detroit Black Chamber of Commerce. There's the Detroit LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce. So you can connect with those groups and say, you know, we're a curling club, we're a curling organization, we're trying to diversify our board members. Could we do a presentation at one of your breakfasts? Or, you know, do you want to come to our curling club and have a curling event, and we'll teach you curling, and then you can get to know a little bit more about the sport, and maybe somebody will, one, it could bring in new members, but two, it could also bring in people that have this great, strong business background that's not curling related, but they have a lot of knowledge and they're able to share that. Also, you can connect with your partners and sponsors for both ideas. How, you know, connect with the sponsor of your national curling association and say, geez, you know, your board is pretty diverse. How did you get to that point? Or what did you do? Or sort of what are the important things to think about? But also for recruits to your board potentially as well, you know, in some cases, or even, you know, former partners or sponsors that used to be connected to your curling organization you may still have a relationship with. That's a resource that you can tap as well. And another way is just to get out into the community and spread your message. Go to community events. Like I was talking about before with Attraction, partner with community organizations. And some of those people, you know, once you start interacting with them and tell them what your organization is about, they may be willing to chip in as well and work in a capacity on, say, a board. So just some parting thoughts before we open it up for questions. The biggest thing about this whole discussion is that you have to make diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of your mission and not just an additional line in your mission statement. It needs to be embraced by everyone in the organization. And those people that you're having a hard time convincing, you're just going to have to work harder to do it because everybody needs to be on the same page. And you have to be willing to get uncomfortable and to do the hard work. This work is hard and you have to do the work. You can't just talk the talk. You can't just put a diversity statement up on a website and call it a day. You have to get uncomfortable. You have to talk to organizations that you've never interacted with before. You have to reach out, you have to make that call, you have to send that email. And that's the only way that you're going to be able to recruit these people from these different backgrounds that are outside of our curling bubble in particular. Make attracting diverse candidates a priority across your entire organization, whether that's you're a small curling club with 3 part-time staff or 3 full-time staff, or whether you're an international governing body with 17 or 18 staff. It has to be a priority across your organization. Remember that the signals that you're sending are powerful. So as I mentioned, people are constantly scanning and looking for those signals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and also ask for feedback. What did you notice? Ask your members for feedback if you don't have a diverse staff. Once you recruit somebody maybe and bring them into the hiring process and you offer them the position, ask them for feedback about the process and how it went. What did they learn about the organization before they decided to take the job? All of that feedback is very important and will help you build a better strategy going forward. Understand the importance of the various forms of diversity and the complexities of intersectionality. So again, we can't just focus on one type. It's not good enough to just be gender diverse. We have to think about all of the other different forms of diversity and also the challenges that come with individuals who have these intersecting stigmatized identities and how we're going to support them. One and done won't cut it, so avoid the tokenism trap. You can't just hire one person, stick them on your board and say it's good, we've ticked the diversity box and we're all set. Those people, again, oftentimes can get put into this role where it's expected that they're the only ones that have to are expected to do the work on diversity. And that's the other thing too, is that once you start hiring more diverse hires, once you're putting more diverse candidates on your board, don't just task them only with doing the diversity work. We need everybody involved in this. And if you're going to create a diversity, equity, inclusion committee, don't put all of the marginalized people on that committee. There needs to be other people in there as well. And it should be a nice mix of people. This will take time, as most strategic initiatives do, but you've got to start now and you've got to commit to it. So don't think that, again, one hire isn't going to do it. A couple of your attempts to make connections with organizations or groups or individuals might fail, but you need to pick yourself up and keep going. And again, ask for help, ask those, ask your partners, ask your sponsors, ask, those other organizations and governing bodies that you work with. Share information. That's one of the most important things that can be done. And remember the relationship. Diversity is nothing to performance without inclusion. So yes, hiring them is great, but what are you doing to create the inclusive space for your new hires so that they stay? And that gets into this concept of sort of retention and a number of issues that come up with retention of marginalized individuals and organizations, including things like allyship, including things like culture, organizational culture. And I hope that at some point, I might be able to do another webinar to kind of focus on those aspects as well. But this is really the first start, is getting people in. And then we can talk later about, the part that comes after that, which is keeping them happy and making everybody feel welcome. So that's all I have for today. So I'd love to hear your questions. And my email address is there. Again, I'm at Michigan State University here in Michigan. So please feel free to reach out, especially, I can't wait to hear your questions and I hope you all have some, but if you do have any specific questions about your particular organizations or curling clubs or whatever it is, and you kind of would like to have a more one-on-one conversation when I can kind of help you work through some of the challenges, I'd love to do that. So please feel free to reach out. But for now, I will end there. And I guess, Sarah, you can take the reins if you want.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for that presentation. We actually had a question coming quite early. So it's from an anonymous attendee, so I will read it, you can answer. It's how does a college degree limit the applicant pool, especially in jobs that likely do not really need a college degree?
So I think you do have to think about, again, who could you be excluding when you are requiring that somebody have a certain degree? So you have to be, this is where, again, coming up with that job description, that job posting is really important. So understanding what is needed in the job, is a college degree necessary? Because it may very well not be. But a lot of times people just put that in as the default because they believe that that says something about, again, somebody's status or somebody's sort of class or anything like that, or just that well, you would expect them to have a college degree. But if it's not necessary for the role that's being hired for, then then potentially you don't need to have that in there. And so you have to be very careful, like I said, about your wording, about what you're putting in as the requirements for the job, so that you're not, automatically excluding people who could very well do the job, are wonderful candidates, and potentially add to your diversity, just because you're giving them some standard that isn't necessary for the job that they're doing. I hope that I answered that correctly, but.
I think so. We have, thank you. One more question from Christine. She says, my club is historically an old boys club. Whiteboard, women aren't members. We are renters. How do we get across to them? I recognize this type of club. I would love to hear your answer.
So that's a great question. And we know that that's an issue in curling clubs. And this is a common thing in sport organizations as well. We joke that in sport organizations as a whole, leadership is pale, male, and stale, right? So they're old white men, basically, is what we have. And what needs to happen is that there are people that do need to speak up. So if it is, an all white board, I don't know if there's really, women aren't members, we're renters. So again, I'm sure that there's not as much women representation in terms of staff roles or in board roles. But the idea here is that you just need to explain to them, again, the cases for making these change. And I actually had somebody the other day, it was a student in one of my classes, say, how far should I push in trying to make some of these changes? And that's why I said at the end, this work is hard and it's going to be uncomfortable, and you have to be able to get uncomfortable. So again, you can make the case to them for, the moral case. Also, the changing demographics. I don't know where you're at, Christine, but in the United States in particular, our demographics are shifting rapidly. Canada, I feel like, is the same way. And so if you want to be able to survive and thrive, you're going to have outreach to populations that are, typically not represented in curling traditionally. And by having people in leadership roles that are similar to those individuals that you're trying to seek out, those underrepresented populations, that can actually really help to, again, increase the diversity of your membership, which again, is good for business. And so that's the other thing too. That's what I find, especially with that old boys club mentality and that sort of old white man who is this typical sport leader. They oftentimes listen to the business case. So you can provide them with that information that says why this makes sense from a financial perspective, from an economic perspective, even if they don't think the moral case is really that important. Oftentimes the business case will get to them.
So Christine just had another comment saying the saving grace is an openly gay man and 2 women on the board. They had to do that because they got reject for funding because they weren't inclusive.
So, and again, that speaks to the business case again, right? I mean, sometimes if you're looking for grants, if you're looking for certain funding applications, they're going to ask questions about those things. And so, but the challenge is that does that openly gay man and the 2 women on the board, do they have a lot of say? And so that kind of gets at sort of the next segment of making sure that once you bring them in to the circle, then making sure that they're able to actually effectively make change and sort of contribute, or are they just being silenced and they're just meant to be, again, those tokens that are when they put the picture of the board up, they they proudly show that they have 2 women on the board or things like that. But they are, but they're really silenced and they don't have a whole lot of work. In which case, again, this work takes time. And so you have to think about things in terms of governance structures. How long are people expected to be on the board? When people rotate out from those positions, that's when there has to be a really big push to get more diverse voices in, so that when you have one of those old boys club members rotate off the board, how, especially those people that are on the board currently, they can be doing things like I was mentioning in the presentation about reaching out to groups, trying to get more diverse candidates to apply for those board positions or to go up for a vote. And hopefully that can affect change later on.
Yes, thank you. We have 3 more questions. But just Christine also commented that they don't have a say, like these people are more tokens. So maybe someone who's brought on just to get that funding, but then not actually given space. I don't know if you want to comment on that too.
Which one was it? Sorry again, Sarah.
Christine, the openly gay man and the women on the board
Yep.
do not actually have a say. This is how I understand the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think she also mentioned that they're financial trouble and they don't see this, diverse people's ideas are voted down. So, I mean, the one thing that I will say is that you're going to have these situations that occur. However, there's going to come a point where they're going to have to make a decision. Do they want to make a change for the better and be able to prolong the life of their curling club? Or are they okay with it shutting down because they're refusing to embrace change and refusing to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion? Christine, I'll just say if you want to chat one-on-one, please email me and we can talk maybe about some strategies or some ways to be able to address this in sort of a tactical way, sort of evidence-based. And I'd love to chat with you about that specifically, because your situation is one that can be common, but is also one that we hope that we're kind of getting past now. And it's more that people are just struggling with ideas rather than getting a whole lot of resistance.
Yes. Do you have time? Just it's great. We're getting quite a lot of questions. So Sonia is next, and then we have Anonymous, Marianne, Kenji, and Maggie. Just so that you know that. Yeah. That's the question that we got in that order. So Sonia wrote that I have tried to get more diverse individuals interested in the board that I serve on. I start by trying to get people into board committees as a pipeline. However, that is seen by some as not prestigious enough. At times, when I've asked some people to consider a run for the board, they think it's too much work to be on the board, but then serving on committees isn't prestigious enough for them either. What am I doing wrong?
So one of the things I think is that people do like to be members of boards because people do find it prestigious. Sometimes it's good for a resume, sometimes it's good, to show that sort of community involvement. And again, people like to be able to make decisions. It feels like they have power. But my question would be about, so maybe there is a problem with your governance structure where those committees need to be empowered to do a little bit more. And so that when people are working on those committees, they actually do get to come up with policies, create change, bring up initiatives and sort of see them follow through, so that it feels like, because that is a good way to build that board pipeline by putting people in those sort of those committee level roles. But you have to make sure that, again, they have a feeling of being able to get things done, especially if they are committing time. If there's a committee meeting twice a month or once a month for 3 hours or whatever it is, that's time they're taking away to do that. So if you're going to make sure that they're participating in those committees, that they're also getting something out of it, that they're going to be able to feel like they're effectively making change. And so if that's not happening, and again, they feel like, it's not sort of worth their time, there needs to be a greater discussion at the board level about how you can empower those committees a little bit more, because of the reason that they can form a great pipeline for board members. So I wouldn't say that you're doing anything wrong per se. I just think that there's probably maybe some greater challenges with the governance structures in your club. And you can sort of take a step back and sort of look at ways that you can create committees or empower committees to do more work.
Thank you. So Marianne is asking, could you recommend an equally straightforward signaling as the he, him, his, in case language does not have a gender inclusive pronouns?
That is a really great question. That is something that we also have to be concerned with, because again, different languages do have different uses of things like pronouns. I think that there are some ways that you could potentially maybe, like if people do a diversity training, maybe you could have like a badge or something that shows, like if you have your page of staff, staff bios or board bios or whatever it is, maybe everybody's done their diversity and inclusion training. Maybe there's a badge you can create that sort of goes next to their picture or next to their name. That again shows that that's pretty, and you just would have a little key somewhere that shows that like, oh, completed X, this kind of training. It'd be similar to how if you have coaches, right? And coaches have a level of training. They're a level 3 coach, they're a level 4 coach, they're a national team coach. That's a great way to show that, again, people have been trained in some of these, different strategies and sort of things to remember when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and sort of that they embrace people of differences and all of those types of things. So yeah, I mean, it's a little tricky when you can't just obviously sort of default to those pronouns, although they are, I found that in certain places they are becoming a little bit more prominent, even places I didn't think they would be. But again, if there is no sort of language transition, that is something that you could do. And again, that speaks to a wide group of individuals, right? Like with pronouns, a lot of people think about those people that are, not on the gender binary or who are transgender, who might have bisexual minorities. But if you think about something like a diversity and inclusion training badge, that speaks to a broader swath of sort of racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation diversity, all of those types of things. So that might be something to do. If you don't have that training yet, it's a great opportunity to do it and then be able to put that out there.
Great, thanks. So Kenji is saying, hello, I'm joining from Japan. As a volunteer, I've been trying to help people from all over the world and with different backgrounds to enter Japanese society with as less obstacles as possible. I believe that sports are one of the gateways for anyone to get together. Dr. MacCharles says you spent time in Japan to help clubs promote the inclusion. Could you tell us what it was like?
So I will say that it's interesting. When I was in Japan originally in 2005 and 2006 teaching English, I was not open about my sexual identity. And when I went back in 2018, I was married, I was openly gay and married to a man. And so, I was a little bit nervous about going back into that setting and people asking me questions. And, people are obviously very interested in your life, especially, somebody that's new in your space. And so I knew that they would ask me a lot of questions and I didn't want to have to hide anything. So I knew from the get-go I was going to be very open. And I was very accepted by everybody I interacted with in both sort of the curling space that I was in and also in broader sort of Japanese society and the different individuals that I interacted with. But I 100% agree with you that sport is a way to bring in people from diverse backgrounds and to sort of get them into a situation where you have teamwork, you get to work together and you can learn about other people that are different from you. And that can help you create these relationships with people, and that helps to reduce things like our bias. And so I think the Japanese example is really interesting because they are getting much more progressive, especially on LGBTQ issues. I know that there was just this court ruling in Japan that basically said that banning same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. It's still not obviously a national right in Japan to be able to do that, but I think that they are making progress. I think that having events like the Olympics come and in spaces of the Olympics, sometimes there are pride houses and those types of things that sort of bring about. And again, it's just, the Olympics is really a showcase of diversity by bringing in people from all over the world. And so I think that in terms of I think it's a great opportunity to bring in people from different backgrounds into the sport, and also to be able to then have those people engage with Japanese people. And I would love for you to reach out and us to have another conversation about this sort of specifically. I'd like to know a little bit more about sort of the kinds of clubs you're operating in and sort of where you're at, and how you might be able to sort of reach out to some community organizations and be able to bring them into the fold, which again will sort of help build your goal of improving inclusion through sport.
Thanks. So Maggie is wondering, what's your thoughts on having requirements of diversity on board or committee? For example, 3 office bearers and no more than 2 of any one gender. Is that a good idea, or is it forcing something we should be achieving naturally?
That is a great question. And the one thing that we worry about with quotas is that we're just putting in tokens into the seats, right? And so we do have to be a little bit careful about that. But I'm sort of also of the mind that, especially in the beginning, when you're trying to diversify your board, you might have to be very specific about choosing somebody who is from a marginalized background or a stigmatized background in sport. And I think that it can be effective, especially in the beginning, to create some diversity on those boards so that you don't have that homologous reproduction happening. And so you are looking to bring in people that don't look like the traditional composition of the board. Now, one of the things that can help that, obviously, is, again, building that pipeline. So by going out there, doing outreach and getting people to apply for these positions or to be nominated for these commissions that are of the background. So then it does kind of happen more naturally. Although you may be going out there and explicitly searching for these people, again, you're bringing, it's different if you have 4 candidates for a position and only 1 is a woman and 3 are men, then, there's a 25% chance she gets it. But if you're bringing, and they're all white, but if you're bringing in 4 candidates and, 1 is a white woman, 1 is a Muslim man, 1 is, an openly gay white man, 1 is, a white woman or something like that. If you can diversify that pool, then again, it gets easier to sort of to just choose somebody who obviously is going to fit the dynamic of being somebody who is diverse or not, or from a marginalized group. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I do think that it's probably something that needs to be done in organizations when they're first trying to increase that diversity. But I also think that eventually it will just work itself out, where when people are rotating off the board, and if you've built up a good enough pipeline, there's going to be diverse candidates there waiting to join. So I hope that answers your question. But I don't think it's a bad thing per se. And I think it might be necessary in some cases with certain organizations in the early stages of them trying to do this work. But then hopefully within a cycle or two, you'll get a pretty good pipeline and it will just happen naturally.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So Sonia just wrote that she loved your presentation, and
oh, thank you.
It's posted soon so that it's available to watch again. I will try and post it as soon as I can, Sonia. And if anyone else has a question, then feel free to ask it now. Or I just want to say thank you very much for your time, Jeff. Really appreciate you coming on and having this presentation, and we will be posting it on YouTube so that you can share it with others. So thank you.
Thank you again for inviting me to do this. And again, I'm very passionate about this work, so it fills my heart with joy to talk about this sort of thing and to have these kinds of conversations. And I just hope that we can continue these conversations even offline. Again, as I said, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help anybody, whether you're with a curling club or a curling organization at the regional or national or international level. Anything I can do to help you all, I will do.
Well, thank you. So great finishing words, and have a good rest of your day, everyone, or a good evening if you're in Europe with me. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.